Spencer Ackerman is an award-winning national security author and journalist. He has reported from the front lines of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Guantanamo Bay. He shared the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service Journalism for Edward Snowden's NSA leaks to The Guardian. One of his core ideas, though, and the reason why I'm speaking to him today, is that he argues what ICE is doing is a lingering function of the war on terror. With ICE's uses of, for example, detention centers as quasi-black sites like Alligator Alcatraz and many others, or the creation of extra legal justification for their behavior and many other factors, Ackerman believes you cannot understand what ICE is doing without realizing it's the U.S. war on terror simply brought home. In this interview, we discuss the depths of the core thesis he puts forward, the racialized force of ICE's mission, and why none of this can actually be reformed. Here's Spencer Ackerman. Spencer Ackerman, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Luke.
Spencer, I have so many questions about the war on terror and how it relates to what ICE is doing, and we're going to explore this. And I know you've written about it on your Substack, Forever Wars. But just as a sort of a way to start the conversation, having watched what ICE has become, what they're doing now in Minnesota, they've not gone to New York, but they've been here in D.C., and I got to witness firsthand what they were doing. What are your general impressions of what you're looking at? When you see all of this, what are some of your major takeaways about what it all is and what it means?
Harvest of a rotten fruit, long sown within the cursed soil of the war on terror. The major coming out party of ICE hasn't been on the streets of Chicago or Minneapolis or Charlotte or Washington or Los Angeles. It was in New Bedford, Massachusetts, more than 15, nearly 20 years ago, on a series of workplace raids that terrorized the community there. Then as now, they assaulted people who were just trying to work to earn a living. It was from the start aimed not at employers who were exploiting undocumented labor, but undocumented labor itself. We see that today in Home Depot parking lots, from Minneapolis to Los Angeles. This is not something that's happened recently. This is not something that metastasized recently. It's something that from the very beginnings of the war on terror sowed the seed of the idea that the United States requires, for reasons of national security, an extremely invasive, internally focused deportation force. That is something, while not unprecedented in American history, certainly ideologically, there's been a nativist current in the United States since as long as there's been a United States, practically. But as a mechanism, as a license to perform deportations from deep internally into the country, for the criminalization of migration, that's something that has a very recent vintage. And it's not something that we should accept as eternal or necessary.
One thing I want to sort of use to set the table for this conversation is that you've argued that the war on terror should be understood less as a series of discrete overseas conflicts and more as like a governing paradigm and to how we can understand certainly its lasting impact in the United States. So, look, help me understand, why is that the case? Why do you use it through that analytical lens and treat it as a broader set of policy failures and rather than a historical episode?
First and foremost, because it's not ended. The war in Afghanistan has ended. The war in Iraq has transmuted so many different times that it can be kind of dizzying to trace the fact that there are 900 officially, probably closer to between 1,500 and 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria, because nearly 25 years ago, a group of fanatics hijacked planes and flew them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, in an act of mass murder. But nevertheless, these things remain today. But they, as well, always happened inside the United States. This was never something that was always focused overseas. It was something that always from the start looked at people inside the United States as an internal enemy, whether that was Muslim communities around the country, whether that was immigrants, recent immigrants, who were treated as a security threat and rounded up after 9/11, regardless of having no connection to the attacks of 9/11. And because the way that the new authorities, institutions, and operations of the war on terror transformed the relationship between freedom and security in this country. To give just one example, a very important law called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, passed days after 9/11, doesn't really work to empower the president to address those who committed 9/11. It empowered the president to define very expansively and exclusively who could be conceivably targetable for acts both on 9/11 or similar enough to, or a web of association emanating outwards. That became a transformation in the powers of the presidency that has never been repealed. It was a crucial step to making the president, whether Democratic or Republican, something closer to an elected king in the United States. And that's something that I feel works better to understand as a paradigm than as discrete actions taken after 9/11, institutions and created after 9/11, and authorities granted after 9/11 that, probably 75 to 80% of which remain in force today.
It's interesting. I was 23 when we invaded Iraq. I watched 9/11 from my senior college dorm room. I luckily never had to go because I was in Marine Corps artillery. And at the time, they didn't really need us. And then I got out in late 2004. And so I was able to avoid the worst of it. But I certainly, essentially all my friends were not nearly as lucky about this. Is the idea that the war on terror, as you best understand, at least in the germination stages, so to speak, was that the nation wanted to respond to a series of what they perceived to be attacks, aggressions, threats more broadly, and that they didn't have, as they saw it, as Bush, Wolfowitz, Cheney, as they saw it, they didn't have the requisite tools to respond. So they got John Yoo to write up authorization for torture in Guantanamo Bay. They created a parallel system of both tactics and explanations and legal justifications to enable them to have the kind of war that otherwise the existing laws or whatever did not let them have.
I would say that there were people in the Bush administration and allied with it that saw 9/11 as an opportunity to transform America and move it more in the direction that they thought it should move in, with national security broadly understood as the kind of heart of that new compact. Whether they could have done this under existing authorities or not, I think kind of misses the point. I think the point was this was a crisis that elites of the time interpreted for the country as something epical and something that required one of the most expansive military responses the United States has really ever launched. And for that reason, this was less a matter of listening to the demands of the American people than interpreting for the American people what they wanted those demands to be, if that makes sense.
When you say the demands, I mean, this is something I was looking at recently. Early support for the Iraq War was at like 80%. And then, of course, it faded quite dramatically. By the time 2005, for example, was happening, support had dramatically declined. So when you talk about the demands of the American public, specifically, what do you mean in this context?
I mean, in terms of a demand for a response for 9/11, before you can get to that, it was like 60, it was like 70, 80% support invasion support of the invasion of Iraq ahead of the invasion in 2003. Before that could happen, the political system in this country, journalistic system in this country, all of the different kind of elite institutions that help shape, define, interpret the outside world for regular people had pushed toward the most militarized and the most expansive understanding of a response to the war, or a response to 9/11 that had as its central component the idea that there must be a deeply expansive war, launched out of this, laughed at the idea that there was any alternative response to that, and kind of sought what we would call today cancellation of those who argued either against it or pointed out that the history of these sorts of imperial adventures both is a history of bloodshed and futility, and also that there is a history behind 9/11 that didn't start on 9/11, that starts with decades of American exploitation, extractive foreign policy, and support for repression in the Middle East, specifically in the Muslim world. More generally, the paradigmatic example, the most famous example, was the widespread denunciation of the distinguished American writer Susan Sontag, who had the temerity 2 weeks after 9/11 for saying that history had not started when the Twin Towers fell, and that in fact, while not justifying the attack, interpreted what was coming as more of the same thing that 9/11 resulted from. After that, you could have people like Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld argue that Iraq, argue deceitfully, Bush as well, that Iraq had something to do with 9/11, had something to do with Al-Qaeda. And accordingly, once people understood Iraq as an extension of 9/11, as an extension of an attack on the reprisal against Al-Qaeda, that was necessary for the creation of, as you point out, the shallow but broad political support that the invasion of Iraq relied on as fuel.
Have you given consideration to what, I'm not going to say an alternate war on terror, because I don't think that would be the right way to frame it. However, an alternate response to 9/11 that would have prevented the kind of state repression that we're now suffering under, the vast. Was there a response to 9/11 that was available to us that prevents our current predicament, that did not pursue a global war on terror, that unleashed all kinds of hell on the earth and now has returned home? And if so, what does that look like? I realize that it would have been untenable in the moment given the national mood, but have you given consideration to how that would have looked?
Yeah, consideration. I would let's take that first, and then I want to take up the claim that the national mood would have prevented that. You would have had a response that targeted just Al-Qaeda, just the leadership of Al-Qaeda. It could have been in the shape of taking up the Taliban's offer to give Osama bin Laden to either the United States or a proxy that could try him for his complicity in 9/11. Would that have prevented future attacks? Of course it would. It would have decimated Al-Qaeda as it existed then. And it would have, as we have now seen, there was not really a follow-up wave of attack that was in motion after 9/11. The security services like to argue that they prevented one, but there doesn't really actually, when you go through the accounts, particularly like in custody of people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Abu Zubaydah and others, they really had that in motion. So the war on terror relied on the paranoid sense, then justified as, what would come to be known as the 1% doctrine, a term that the writer Ron Suskind coined in response to what he saw as Dick Cheney's preferred policies, that if there's a 1% chance of another attack happening, that has to be treated as a certainty. We know where that has led, right? We will have to only imagine an alternative at the time, because obviously it's a counterfactual conditional, but it would have addressed the necessary, it would have addressed actually what Al-Qaeda was looking to do. And then there would have been, there ought to have been a series of policy responses more broadly to reconceptualize, demilitarize, and kind of normalize America's relationship with the Middle East, so that it wasn't simply a security guarantor and funder of repressive states from Saudi Arabia to Egypt to Israel. So, it would have looked something like that. But what I really want to stress is that the war on terror was not an organic popular response to 9/11. The war on terror was the essence of manufactured consent. It was an enterprise that relied on deceit of the American people from the government, that relied on overwhelming secrecy and non-disclosure of what the actual operations of the war on terror was, specifically the surveillance and torture aspects of the war on terror, and a political response that might have spared the US and the world so much bloodshed and turmoil was very deliberately prevented by both the avarice of Republicans and the cowardice of Democrats.
That being said, that brings us to our present moment a little bit, which is, to what extent does the war on terror explain the rise of Trumpism? There are competing theories around this. One is that the war on terror has enabled Trumpism to be more of what it has designs on being, rather than it being a cause of its ascension more generally. Where do you come down on this debate and the role in the war on terror and its relationship to Trumpism in our present moment?
I think the war on terror is a central and underappreciated aspect of what gave rise to Trump, what Trump was responding to, and what, most importantly, provided him both the extant justifications and the tools to accomplish his agenda. So, for instance, if you remember 2015, Trump was talking nonstop about ISIS, and he was using the failure of American elites in the Republican Party first, and then the Democratic Party, who supported not just the war in Iraq, but the war on terror generally, that had led to so much futility, as engines of discrediting them and displacing them from pole position that they occupied within American politics. Furthermore, what gave Trump his first real political, I guess both platform isn't exactly the right word, but his move from kind of cultural prominence to political prominence came through him championing what we know as birtherism, the idea that Barack Obama was an illegitimate president because he was not a citizen of the United States, and we would see what that meant in practice was implying that he was secretly a Muslim and accordingly was a national security threat to the United States. This was always a baseless lie, but it took root because of, at that point, in 2011, when Trump started going on Fox News and championing birtherism, at that point, 10 years of war on terror that had portrayed Muslims in the United States as a danger to America and as and also treated the champions of civil rights, of the rule of law, of restraint of the war on terror as little more than the handmaidens or collaborators with people who sought to do America harm. There are other things that explain Trumpism, the Great Recession certainly, but the war on terror is always there. It's always there in very visible and very dramatic manifestations that give Trump power and that Trump recognizes and uses to both acquire more and cement his place in American politics.
The turn that ICE has taken more recently, to what extent do you attribute that merely to the machinations and malice of Stephen Miller versus the broader kind of Trumpist project?
Hard to disambiguate, I think. I think there would always be a Stephen Miller. There's always been a Stephen Miller throughout history, right? There's always been someone who sees a pathway to political power through the persecution of marginalized entities and the presentation of them as internal threats, not only to the safety of the United States, but to a white supremacist understanding of what the legitimate United States of America is. I don't really know how cynically Trump has used this politics. I don't care, because it doesn't, that question doesn't impact any material instantiation of what Trumpism is or how ICE operates. Whether it would have been Miller or someone else, the moving force behind child separation during the first Trump administration was not Stephen Miller. It was John Kelly, who has now become, a moderate anti-Trumpist now that it suits his needs. But Kelly was someone who sought to use the kidnapping of children as a way to deter people from crossing the southern border, because he had a pedigree as the senior military officer in charge of operations in Latin and South America. It is no accident that someone in that position, particularly someone like Kelly, whose trial by fire comes through the war on terror, comes through things like the Battle of Fallujah, comes through the Marine fight in Helmand Province, where Kelly loses his son, who was a captain commanding a company of Marines during that time, and interprets that, all of that sacrifice, that hardship, that loss, in a nativist way, attributes the loss not to the futility of the enterprise, but to betrayal by political elites at home, which is curious given that most of them actually backed the war, not only in Iraq, but Afghanistan. And this becomes the fertile soil through which not just Trumpism develops, but is the kind of it is the engine that produces many of Trump's deputies that become the architects of what ICE becomes in not just this current Trump presidency, but the first one.
One of the key features of your work, as best I understand it, is trying to understand the war on terror as a function of continuity rather than these sort of distinct periods and ruptures, and in how that has affected American politics. With that in mind, such that I've got that portion correct, do you see what ICE is doing as what people might call boomerang theory, which is these practices deployed abroad now being redeployed at home? Or is it immigration enforcement, nominally anyway, remixed with some kind of counterinsurgency logic? How do you understand how ICE operates in these terms?
So something that I really try to impress upon in my journalism is that there isn't one United States of America that operates at home and another United States of America that operates abroad. There's one United States of America. What it does abroad is a reflection of what it does at home. And then what it does at home is a laboratory for what it does abroad. And then what it does abroad is a laboratory for what it brings back home. And these things iterate upon one another. They influence one another. They influence, they influence how the development of each comes into being and creates greater and greater injustices and opportunities to inflict those injustices both at home and abroad. I think, I do think that the so-called imperial boomerang theory has a lot of merit. The only thing that I kind of caution against is the idea that it's either thrown abroad first or thrown at home first. This is something that's thrown kind of back and forth again and again, and it's hard to kind of figure out what the origins of it are because of this intertwined nature of how America operates both at home and abroad. Certainly, there are innovations that come to bear on it. The hysteria against immigrants that happens after 9/11 is deeply influenced by the decades that come before it. In particular, there's a demographic panic in California in the 1990s over how, and this is obviously something absurd to consider for anyone who knows the history of how California became part of the United States. The idea that California is importing Mexicans is kind of laughable to a student of history, but nevertheless, that was how it was perceived amongst reactionary currents in California in the 1990s, and that forms a great deal of context for how immigration in a post 9/11 era ought to be understood. Not understood as a process of making more Americans, but understood as a threat to both the security and the political sovereignty of those Americans who are already here.
One of the things that's interesting to me is, or noteworthy anyway, is how much immigration detention and the current ICE violence campaign seems to operate in a place where constitutional protections thin out. Might be the best way I can describe that. Do you see ICE exploiting these various, what appear to be, at least I'm not sure exactly the legality of some of them, but there appears to be a fair degree of legal ambiguity, or at a bare minimum, certainly legal impunity. On the one hand, if I told someone about the connection between ICE and the war on terror, there might be, perhaps if they don't know your work, there'd be a little bit of apprehension about making a connection. At the same time, it almost seems like inevitable that they ended up in this place, given that the war on terror created so many sort of exceptions of law or places they could operate independent of normal channels. Do you see that same kind of connectivity, particularly with immigrant detention and some of the lawlessness related therein?
Absolutely. You can see how in immigration detention, the torture that existed in a different form in the CIA's black sites is taking root. One of the things that I was very struck by in a recent Amnesty International report into Alligator Alcatraz is they use something, multiple detainees there described the use of something called a confinement box. They didn't use that term, but that's a term that I'm using because it was how the thing operated in the CIA's network of undisclosed torture prisons. It's a box barely bigger than a coffin. You can't lie down, you can't stand up, you have to be kept in a very uncomfortable crouching position for an extended period of time in a claustrophobic environment. This is a mechanism not just of physical torture, but psychological torture, and used in Alligator Alcatraz as punishment. If you disobey whatever the Florida immigration authorities operating Alligator Alcatraz want you to do, you will be taken into the box. They didn't have apparently a kind of solitary confinement hole, but they had something that clearly reflected familiarity with the way torture operated during the war on terror in which the kind of political antecedents of the same nativist cohort behind Trumpism eagerly defended, enthusiastically defended, and denounced opponents of, because they thought that this was a just punishment for people that they had come to see as less than human. I guess the best way of perhaps putting it is the way that the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben put it at the dawn of the War on Terror, when he described it as a state of exception. He's building on the work of a prior, frankly, fascist philosopher named Carl Schmitt, for understanding that Schmitt, who had said that sovereign is he who defines the state of exception. I might have taken that from Hobbes, I forget. But the point is that the state of exception operates as a carve out from the official rules. So people who are not subject to the depredations of the carve out of those rules, that kind of non-legal, extra-legal space in which anything can be done to those who fall under it, can feel that there is no disruption of normalcy. There is no disruption in the things that they visibly see and enjoy, but in fact is this cancer that will expand and run away the institutional foundations of the freedoms that those not subject to this state of exception enjoy, until we get to a point where an ICE agent shoots someone who is moderately inconveniencing them multiple times through the forehead and then calls her a fucking bitch.
You have talked previously about Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, and ways in which that is connected to the war on terror, but in particular way, as I understand it, namely what we as a country decided to prosecute in terms of looking at his reign of terror and doing essentially nothing to stamp out the antecedent kind of factors that brought that to bear. But when it came to the global war on terror, we're all too happy to unleash violence abroad and now bring something of that home in the form of ICE. I wonder if you could help me understand, and the audience can understand more of the connection. How does Timothy McVeigh relate to the war on terror? And then more broadly, bring it full circle if you can, and it brings us to the present moment with ICE in terms of who gets targeted and for what purposes by state violence and who doesn't.
Yeah, sure thing. So I start out my book, Reign of Terror, with not 9/11, but the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing that Timothy McVeigh perpetuates. And I do so to show how what was at the time the worst terrorist attack in American history was treated as a marginal event by the power structure once it was determined that it was committed by a white man in his depraved depiction of restoration of the just social position of the white man within American society. It was treated, in other words, as a one-off event. It was treated as something that prosecution could very easily rectify. There was no need to transform the country onto a wartime footing. There was no need to connect what McVeigh did to the broader white supremacist ideology that he constructed. And there was no need to go looking at the broader infrastructure in the United States of white supremacist militancy that had existed for, not just in McVeigh's case, the infrastructure that comes to exist in the United States after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which takes white supremacy kind of a step, this is a very debatable step out of power, but transforms the relationship between Black citizens of the United States and the availability of American democracy to them in a way that white supremacists interpreted as illegitimate ever since. Nor did anyone in journalism feel the need to connect McVeigh's actions and the murder of 169 people 168 people, including 19 children, to that ideology. Instead, more often than not, it treated McVeigh as a kind of curiosity. There were headlines in the Washington Post and other newspapers that portrayed McVeigh as in like weirdo contexts that talked about him as like an unfortunate child of divorce. Would divorce theoretically make more Timothy McVeighs? No, white supremacy and its acceptability within the United States is what makes Timothy McVeigh's, and it's what, frankly, makes Jonathan Ross's.
So is there a way to understand? Obviously, they're going after immigrants, although that's not the only part of what their dragnet grabs. But how do you understand how race factored into the war on terror and how it factors into how that connects to ICE's operations?
Centrally, we are looking at, the war on terror only applies to non-white people. I think, the McVeigh example demonstrates that. But more importantly, the war on terror itself created in its early phases and then persisting throughout the 2010s and now the 2020s, an alternate system of quote unquote justice that applies to Muslims, not just in the United States, but also abroad. It became acceptable. Let me put it like this. In 2016, I interviewed Pakistanis and Yemenis who had been either survivors of Obama's drone strikes or their relatives had been killed by them. And to a man, what they talked about was racism driving those operations, that they were treated by the United States as subhuman and backward, easily killed because of a racial hierarchy that was somewhat head-spinning for me to listen to, given that they were talking, as they knew, about the first Black president of the United States. What each of them went back to time and again was the fact that the only time Obama named and apologized for innocent people killed by one of his drone strikes was when they were white hostages of the so-called Islamic State. That was something that incensed and inflamed people who had no choice but to live with the consequences of drone strikes that had either they had barely survived or had killed people that they loved. They understood this as a sanction that no white person would ever experience from the United States of America without it being treated as a crucial accident. I think all you have to do is look at the Department of Homeland Security's social media, which is filled with white supremacist propaganda, encouraging the recruitment of people to whom that propaganda resonates to join ICE and CBP, to sign up for the mass, even calling it deportation, I feel like is a sanitized euphemism. The United States is sending people, to include 170 US citizens, at least by ProPublica's count, not to their so-called countries of origin, which is what we typically mean by deportation, but to third countries, whether it's CCOT in El Salvador, whether it's South Sudan or elsewhere, that they have no connection to at all. That's not a deportation. That's something closer to what we saw in the War on Terror, a rendition in which the United States captures someone that it sends abroad, not for any criminal process or face charges that they will have to answer to in a certain country, but to a completely unfamiliar place for a far harsher set of treatment. This has impacted, infected, and is now central to the operations of ICE in a manner that really ought to disturb us in its resonance with the war on terror, its legacy from the war on terror, but above all, from the simple fact that this enforces at gunpoint in the most frightening ways possible hierarchy that I believe most Americans do not actually want to see visited upon them, does not want to see themselves and their neighbors subject to, and instead something that they consider rightfully something to struggle against. We're recording this on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. How could we possibly honor Martin Luther King Jr. by having ICE march through as an incipient death squad Minnesota on a mission to round up primarily Black people? We're not talking just about Somali migrants. Thanks to Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, racial by law enforcement and Homeland Security is legal in the United States. And until Kavanaugh's ruling is overturned, that's exactly how ICE, CBP, affiliated agencies will practice, whether it be under a Democratic administration as well as a Republican administration, until these institutions are abolished, their authorities revoked, and their politics discredited.
As a separate kind of question, I'm sure the war on terror has a function here, although this predates it. Namely, I'm old enough to have grown up in a world where Wayne LaPierre was worried about the government's jackbooted thugs invading people's personal lives and liberty and affecting it. And yet we get to a place now where the right is cheerleaders of jackbooted thugs from the federal government doing exactly that. It's kind of funny. I live in DC. If I drive to more remote parts of Virginia, I'll see "Don't Tread on Me" flags in their yards. And it just seems to me, and I would love your impression here, it just seems to me that people have wondered, how could there be incongruity? The answer is, I don't think that there is. That order of the jackbooted thugs they're worried about, it's to suppress the part of American life that is not theirs. And in fact, that is why you can see them wave a flag about liberty, and then they can do this. It's because it's designed to drive this kind of top-down pressure to protect a certain class. No?
I completely agree. I think that what we're not talking about hypocrisy, right? These are not people with a blind spot. What we're talking about is exceptionalism. We're talking about a system in which there are no restrictions that those who wield it are bound to respect, and upon those that they target, no law can possibly protect. We're talking about a racial hierarchy enforced at the point of a gun with the license of ICE, CBP, and their police allies, as well as their political allies, Republican and Democrat. I think we make a really important analytic mistake when we say, like, aha, but you were saying don't tread on me, and now you were the ones doing the treading. Anyone who's doing that is not making some kind of like fundamental error of incongruity or not connecting two things. They mean both things simultaneously. They mean that they are the ones who must not be treaded on, and their enemies are the ones who must always be treaded on.
I've spoken to historians about this, and it's something you've brought up about how guys like McVeigh is obviously a standout example, how they see themselves as, and to your point that you referenced with the social media imagery and language coming out of DHS, where they're talking about we're the authentic, not merely restoration of American identity, but we're the authentic representations of it, and we're here to reassert what has been lost. It's kind of funny, though. I've been talking to, as I mentioned, some historians about it. One thing they kind of point to is that the inability of the United States to confront, at the time in the 19th century, both proper reconstruction, but really the Confederacy. Obviously, they won the war, but they didn't really stamp out the societal elements that underpin it. And now we're still living with the consequences. Is the theory then that those kinds of forces have weaved themselves back into society as now not merely not a Confederate identity, but as an authentic American identity? But what they really mean is racial hierarchy with whites at the top. But that's the through line from the Confederacy onto McVeigh onto our present moment. Do you see something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that Um, you know, I think it's Viet Thanh Nguyen who said that every war is fought twice: first on the battlefield, and then on the plains of men. So how our historical understanding of these events develops is always contested and is always political. And I would say that something that we see from the Supreme Court currently, and from right-wing legal theorists currently, and you see this probably most dramatically with the push to end birthright citizenship, is a rejection of the Constitution that comes into existence after 1865, that comes into existence with the 13th to 14th Amendment, that the idea that what America is reshaped by after the Civil War is un-American, illegitimate, and must be reversed. This is what this is what first the violence of redemption in the 1870s and 1880s was geared after, and when that attained greater political power, that became Jim Crow. I would add to that a really important period that we haven't talked about, but ought to understand this as, is the Cold War, in which the defense of capitalism geopolitically intertwined extremely neatly with the way that Jim Crow organized racial preferences. One of, I think, the organized racial hierarchy. One of the crucial slogans that people carried on placards to oppose desegregation after Brown v. Board of Ed read, "Race mixing is communism." Now, that's just simply not what communism is. It's not what socialism is. But nevertheless, that was an extremely true statement about how a certain kind of politically empowered white supremacist, at a time in which that term was respectable, enjoyed elite respectability, as it hasn't in the last several decades, but it's sure come back right now, understood the Cold War and understood what the purpose of the Cold War was. It was for reinforcing that racial hierarchy that was under challenge at home. This is something that is so central to the United States, to its politics, and to its society, that it finds different outlets at different points in history, but also finds deep clashes with other Americans who reject those understandings. And that's something that we're also seeing. We're seeing right now in vertical videos on our phones from Minnesota.
You have argued on your Substack that
Can I just actually quickly say? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have a newsletter, but it's not a Substack.
Okay.
And I oppose the company of Substack. Okay. I juked them with my first year on Substack, took their money and left Substack as soon as my contract expired. I think Substack is a reactionary company. I don't support it, and I just feel compelled to say, let's not turn Substack into a synonym for newsletter. Okay. It is not Q-tips or anything like that. I think newslettering is a cool way of conducting journalism, and you don't need Substack to do it.
Fair enough. I appreciate the correction. Yeah, Forever Wars is where it was written. That's the name of your newsletter. And in it, you had argued unambiguously that ICE should be abolished and it cannot be reformed. What is the central argument around that? Why can't ICE be reformed, even with some substantial reforms?
There is no reforming something that will look at as minor an inconvenience and as minor a taunt as Renee Good provided to Jonathan Ross with an immediate and proud execution. We have seen video after video from Minnesota, and those who are fighting on the front lines in Minnesota for their neighbors and themselves certainly don't need me to tell them about this, of ICE officers after the murder of Renee Good asking people who are protesting them, haven't you learned your lesson yet? Haven't you learned that? That's how a death squad develops. They are recruiting from white nationalist elements who want to be there. There's no retraining this. Once a security agency sees part of its own population as a threat, it will continue to go after that population. Immigration, deportation and immigration enforcement is a pretext here. And we have to understand that. We have to understand where we are kind of in the course of history here. ICE is a new creation. It was created in the emergency of the war on terror on the premise that I don't think is a supportable premise, that immigration crimes in the interior of the United States are now worse than crimes committed by citizens. It relies on a bed of statistical lies, first and foremost, that immigrants are more likely to commit crimes, particularly the undocumented, who would prefer to simply stay out of people's way, that they operate differently than previous eras of American immigration, particularly during times that white people came here through what were essentially open borders because of the necessity of importing a labor force into the United States. I'm not talking about enslaved labor. I'm talking about what comes afterwards. And the idea that it ought to be politically acceptable to keep an interior deportation force in the United States as if crimes committed by undocumented people could not be similarly addressed by normal law enforcement. There's no way of separating the politics of nativism from ICE, from such an interior deportation force, any more than there is separating the nativist politics of the war on terror from the operations of the war on terror. Despite how often the Biden administration and before it the Obama administration attempted to do precisely that. We have so much experience over the last 25 years that I don't think we really can afford to fool ourselves that there's some kind of retraining that could happen here that wouldn't just simply result in a more efficient death squad. The politics of ICE are inseparable from ICE itself. If you wish to stop this from happening, you have to break ICE. You have to take away its authorities. You have to take away its institutional existence. You have to spread it to the winds. And very importantly, you have to prosecute those who have committed crimes, not just on the streets of the cities in which we've seen ICE deployed over the last several years, but in the jails where they have tortured, brutalized, and now we have seen homicide cases. We've seen at least 7 people, I believe, dead in ICE jails over the last year alone. This is a metastasis that's happened here. The only way to address this metastasis is to cut it off at the root. ICE has to be abolished. CBP at the very, very least. I recognize that, for some people, the idea of a border patrol is both, necessary and legitimate. I wonder if, however, people understand that after the war on terror, CBP interprets the border as anywhere within 100 miles of any point of entry. That basically makes the interior of the country the border. And the border is the zone of this country in which anyone, citizen or non-citizen, has the fewest rights that they enjoy anywhere in the United States. If you've ever been pulled out of that line at TSA, you know how true that is. We're past the point in which reform could be metastasized. We're past the point at which reform could be metabolized by ICE. People who believe that are either in positions of power, are either deluding themselves or lying to you.
How do you understand the Democratic Party in its relationship to the global war on terror? And what I mean by that is, certainly in the Iraq War, for example, there was, at least early, obviously, broad bipartisan consensus to get this going. There were some voices certainly out there. Barack Obama famously opposed the war on Iraq. But in general, there was enough of it where it was bipartisan enough to make it work. That soured over time. And here you have, but a Republican president, we have another one of those. But now you are getting some folks like Senator Gallego out of Arizona or Senator Cory Booker out of New Jersey who are saying, well, okay, ICE is a problem, but we have to reform it. But they won't go to the place that I think you quite rightly argue, which is that this is not a reformable institution. How do you understand them as an opposition party and what role they played in the war on terror's escalation and, frankly, its continuation?
I think that it's very disturbing to see elected Democrats and rich consultants, people who make money off the business of politics, who are within the Democratic Party, treat the job that they have now not as stopping ICE from killing people and kidnapping people, but to discipline the people who have taken to the streets to defend themselves and their neighbors, to discipline the left. We saw this throughout the war on terror, where they rejected anti-war and other abolitionist approaches in order to bring the war on terror in line with American values and exceptionalize the quote-unquote abuses as beyond the standard practice of acceptable behavior. All of this is nonsense. It's cowardice. And I think that it misreads the moment in a very fundamental way. What we are seeing with the explosive growth in support of abolishing ICE is the result of what ICE is doing on the streets, that people are coming into contact with, people who never thought that they would ever, obviously people who have lived, under the repression of America's racial hierarchy. This is very, very familiar for them. This is very, very familiar for people who have always been treated as conditional Americans rather than full citizens. To a lot of those people who have been treated as full citizens, this is a shocking moment that exposes reality of what ICE is and where it will go next. And they're having their leaders, particularly in the Democratic Party, tell them that they're seeing no such thing and they should just go back home and vote for the Democrat, give money for the Democrat who's going to retrain ICE or constrain them from doing certain things, but can continue the roundups, can continue the child separations, can continue the renditions. This is a moment in which I think the traditional politics of safety and security are going to be redefined, and redefined in a way that those who are seeking to practice them are going to find redound to their detriment politically, because people are seeing that they're the number one threat to them, to their safety, their security, their freedom, their prosperity, their ability to enjoy what they understood as the American dream, not the immigrant. It's ICE. It's the security agencies predicated on repressing the quote-unquote criminal alien. And I think it's a short step to understanding how accepting those politics in any form is going to reproduce ICE, is going to reproduce what we're seeing in Minnesota and beyond. And that's a politics that frankly just simply has to be confronted and defeated politically. The Democratic Party, the more it sides with ICE against the people, exposes itself, frankly, as an enemy of those people. Is that the position it wishes to be in? That's the choice that the Ruben Gallegos, the Cory Bookers, on down the line really ought to have to confront.
Last one from me. What is the media ecosystem getting wrong about ICE coverage, and what would be a better way for them to cover it from here on out?
Well, I think the mainstream media, and I speak as someone who's worked in mainstream newsrooms for most of my career. It's a bad spot. It has, for frankly justifiable reasons, lost a whole lot of the trust of the American people. I don't just mean people on the right. I mean people on the left. I mean people who are very skeptical of what they see because of how often the media has manufactured consent for atrocities. And we see them doing that to this day. To exceptionalize what ICE has done to Renee Good, to not put it in a context that starts in the War on Terror, that starts in the New Bedford, Massachusetts workplace raids, that continues through child separation and has taken a different and has now taken a kind of different course over the last year and a half, is to fundamentally treat this circumstance outside of reality, outside of history, outside of, I think that's a very dangerous thing for people like myself who claim to be in the business of revealing reality for people who don't have the luxury of digging into this stuff, professionally. I think we're also seeing new media institutions that don't feel beholden to false concepts of objectivity, to positions like the so-called view from nowhere that's been hegemonic in journalism forever, that doesn't seek to look out the window to tell you if it's raining, but just to interview a bunch of people who are inside as to whether or not it's raining. And instead, we're seeing, Status Coup, LA Taco, Drop Site News, Teo, where I'm proud to be a contributor, on and on and on. Platforms like your own, people who may not have, journalistic training and certainly not the elite respectability of mainstream journalism, but are nevertheless doing the hard work of covering what these operations are out on the streets without euphemism and without sanitizing them for the benefit of an existing power structure in which journalism feels it is only talking from one elite position to another. And I think that's, do I love it that an alternative media structure has been necessary to create rather than using the very large legacy platforms that currently exist? I don't, but it's necessary until and unless those institutions are finally ready. I don't want to say all of them to paint with a broad brush. There are many legacy institutions that are doing great work right now. Wired magazine, for instance, I think has done exceptional work. ProPublica, we could be here all day. I just don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but nevertheless, I think we are seeing a new media ecosystem take shape that's fighting both a legacy media ecosystem and also the oligarchic capture that's accelerating so rapidly in recent days. CBS, for instance, a real prime example. After Trump permitted Skydance to purchase Paramount, and now Skydance is returning the favor to Trump by transforming CBS News into essentially a mouthpiece for the administration. I think this ecosystem is not sustainable to people who are interested in ground truth, to people who are interested in justice, and to people who are interested in approaching the world skeptically and treating an illegitimate power structure with the skepticism that it deserves. So it's natural that such an ecosystem develop. I worry about its ability to scale, but that at the same time is also a function of the same oligarchic capture that we're seeing take hold, that the social media platforms owned by very, very few companies. This week we're going to see Skydance basically take over TikTok. We're going to see a whole lot of how when a new media ecosystem catering to this unserved community of readers and viewers and listeners quickly gets suppressed, what's going to come after that? What are we going to transition to beyond that can still scale, that can still inform people, and that can still give people the information necessary to remain safe and free? I don't really have any answers to that.
I suppose I don't either. However, what I can recommend to the viewers and the listeners, Reign of Terror is the book by Spencer Ackerman, as well as Forever Wars is the newsletter. Spencer Ackerman, you've been very generous with your time. I greatly appreciate and admire your work. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you so much, Luke. I really appreciate you having me on, and you also asked some really fantastic questions. So I'm really grateful for the conversation today.
Thank you.